Dr. Stephen Denny, thank you for joining us. You will have 15 minutes in lecture, and the same time at then we will have 15 minutes Q&A session based upon what you're giving us. Okay, this floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to be here. Dr. Baek and the team at Now in North Korea, the new organization set up to bring together people working on North Korea with an interest in unification. Today, I'm going to be talking about some research that was done in collaboration with the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, the point of which was to understand how information is and or can be disseminated within North Korea. Hence the title, Determinants of Foreign Information Use in North Korea. I'm going to present some research findings and implications from this research. As introduced, my name is Dr. Stephen Denny. I'm at Leiden University, a professor of international relations and Korean studies. Let's begin. This is related to the North Korean information environment. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit how I've studied the North Korean information environment, the particular tools I've used, and the people who I've interacted with in order to understand this, the findings from that research, and then some conclusions and discussion. So what determines foreign information use in North Korea? The title sort of gave it away, but this is the basic research question. Foreign information in North Korea is pretty much a continually hot topic. There's a lot of ways that we could think about this to situate it with in terms of real world events. But I think one of the most recent is, of course, the latest rendition of the information war between North and South Korea. This time we have the North in response to information coming into its sovereign territory. The response is to send trash-filled balloons. Now, of course, the conversation and discussion and context of this is sort of beyond the scope of this presentation, but I use this as an example of North Korea's sensitivity with regards to the spread of foreign information. Why is North Korea so sensitive about information flows and what comes in? Well, because its regime attempts to keep a close monitoring and cordon on information coming in. It seeks to only expose its citizens to regime-sanctioned information, the purpose of which is to bolster its legitimacy and its ability to rule. I'd be remiss to not mention that South Korea also does this to some extent, and all countries do this to some extent, really. South Korea also attempts to sort of limit certain types of information exposure to its citizens, but to a much less degree than North Korea. South Korea is, of course, a vibrant liberal democracy, a pluralistic society, and North Korea is neither of those things. It is a personalist dictatorship run by a party that attempts to restrict information. If you sort of disrupt that, the response is, in a sense, balloons coming your way. So the spread of foreign information inside authoritarian regimes more broadly is an interesting question of discussion. I'm not going to go into too much detail of that right now, but it is a bigger question of about information in autocratic regimes. Of course, North Korea is one of these. The North Korean government clearly worries and has worried about this issue and ways to control it. There's a number of reports, both academic and non-academic, that look at how North Korea sort of seeks to control information, leveraging existing state institutions for the purposes of monitoring and suppression. One of the ways that we have increasingly sought to understand the information environment in North Korea is through surveys of those who were former residents of North Korea. These are your North Korean defectors and North Korean defector migrants, refugees, and they have had firsthand experience with how information is disseminated, how information is controlled, and how they themselves interact with information. This is sort of where we're situating our interest here today in the interest of this research. There is evidence that suggests what is going on in North Korea in terms of what determines the spread of information, or more specifically, what determines whether or not someone uses a type of information. But there's limits to that. Some of these limits we're going to overcome. I'm going to show you how we overcome them. Some of these we cannot. So we cannot run sort of probabilistic surveys or nationally representative surveys of the North Korean population. Obviously, the North Korean regime would never allow that. But we can do the next best thing, I would argue, and that is to interact with people, to survey, and to interview those who have come from that place in order to understand how that information circulates and what determines whether or not someone uses this. However, we believe that the tools that have been used to investigate what determines whether someone uses information and thus how information spreads in North Korea has been quite limited. No one has done in our assessment, a particularly good job at using existing social science research tools to understand what determines form of information flows. And this is where we come in. So what we have done is this thing called the choice-based conjoint survey. It's a survey experiment that has been designed online that creates hypothetical scenarios for information use. So what we did is, in collaboration with our sponsor, the NED, and our NGO partners, primarily in South Korea, is we sat down with them and we said, what sort of information do you think about when you put together these information packets? Because, of course, a lot of these NGOs are very politically active. We do have, of course, a normative undercurrent to our research project that is the free flow of information as a sort of democratic ideal. But we are also researchers at the end of the day, and we want to think about how best to understand this. We worked with these NGOs to understand generally these sort of information profiles, as we'll put them, and what constitutes them and how they were constructed. And then we've took these to create scenarios via this choice-based conjoint survey experiment design that we would then give to former residents of North Korea of a particular type. I'll get to the sample here in a second. And we use this to better understand what drives information decisions. So I'm going to actually just show you some examples of what this looks like instead of describing it more. But first, I want to tell you about the people who we surveyed. So, of course, defector surveys are not uncommon. I think they've become increasingly popular, or were quite popular for some time. Of course, with the slowdown in the number of defectors arriving to South Korea, this has changed this sort of research dynamic. Nevertheless, there's a little over 30,000, or roughly 30,000, former residents of North Korea in South Korea. And we surveyed 313 of them. I want to say that we went to great lengths to survey those for whom their connections to North Korea were fairly recent. So almost all of our sample had resettled in South Korea within 5 years, and many within 3. They most had left North Korea or defected from North Korea sometime after 2015. They're of a mixed and somewhat representative, if you will, background of North Korea. So this is a good mix of socioeconomic backgrounds, former party status, and other relevant metrics. You can ask me more questions about this later if you want to know. And I also want to address the fact that, contrary to research which seeks to understand North Korean society broadly, we're not trying to do that. We're trying to understand determinants of for information flow. And if that's the case, this is actually a better sample than a sort of general population survey would be, because those who have defected are those who are the people most likely to come into contact with foreign information. Because firstly, they're from the borderland regions. Most are from North Hamgyong province, of course. And there's a more porous border with China where information can enter. This makes them a better sample to understand those people who would have come into contact with information and the decisions that they would make about that information. So what we did was we designed this experiment, which I'm going to show you a snapshot of here in a second, where the respondents, these North Korean defector migrants, evaluated information profiles. They would be shown 2 hypothetical profiles of information that was designed based upon attributes which define foreign information. I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. And they would choose which of these 2 that they would most likely use when they were in North Korea. We also asked some other questions about how they would then distribute it, but I'm not going to talk about that today. Feel free to ask me some questions about that in the Q&A. They did this 10 times, and they evaluated 10 unique and randomly generated information profiles. These profiles, I'm not going to go through this in great detail, were defined by who provided it, where it was acquired or where they came into that information. The distribution media, was it a USB or something else? The content of that information, is it South Korean content, i.e. a drama? As international content, like perhaps a documentary? The content form, was it a video, text, recorded file, an application? What age group did it target? This was something that came up a lot in our NGO consultations, not something we necessarily thought of. And then the type, is it nonfiction or fiction? We chose for something a little bit more general in order to capture the sort of the dynamics of information flow, rather than specifying like what type of South Korean drama. That makes it harder to generate these random pairs of hypothetical information profiles. That is, of course, both a strength and a limitation. We're going to focus today here on the provider and the acquisition place. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this now. We explore this more in the papers we wrote about this, which I'll link to at the end. But provider and acquisition place deals with elements that are important to understanding information flows, and especially in the literature on information flows in autocratic contexts. So this deals, of course, with trust in social capital, trust between people, social capital that is generated between people or is lacking between people, and how an authority figure like the state regulates space. Of course, information has to flow through space, and states are very interested in regulating spaces. So acquisition place comes into play here. So we're going to focus on that, but there's a lot more here. This is in English what this hypothetical scenario looked like. So we would introduce it to them. I didn't mention, and I want to mention here now, that we worked with an NGO partner by the name of Urion. Urion specializes, among other things, in defector migrant resettlement and in running surveys for international research groups. So we're able to work with our NGO partner, Urion, to recruit a high-quality sample, which we're able to monitor to implement quality control, to make sure we're interacting with who we want to interact with, and to make sure they understood it. So they were introduced to this. They had people on standby to help them in case they got confused, because running survey experiments with the North Korean defector migrant groups is a unique experience. Anyway, it looked like this. And not the best resolution, but the Korean language text looks like this. I'll pause on this for about 5 or 6 seconds so you can take a look at it. Okay, we can always come back to that during Q&A if we want to. So what do we find? What do we learn from this? I'm going to show you the results of the data in the type of statistical analysis that we conduct with choice-based conjoint data. We're going to look at a statistic called marginal means, and it looks a little bit like this. You're going to have the attribute of the profile, the level of the profile, so provider, who provided it, acquisition place, where was it provided. You're going to have a point estimate, which is going to tell you the marginal mean. And that marginal mean can be read, if you look there at the bottom, as the probability an information profile is chosen if attribute level is present. So it's kind of like a likelihood measure, a probability that this thing would work. And what you're looking for is point estimates above 0.5 or 50%. And that means that in this example here, if the provider was a friend, more than 50% of the time that information was used. That means it motivates use, acceptance, and facilitates information flows. So I've already kind of tipped my cap as to what we found. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go over this, but I do want to point out that you can look at this for all of the attributes of interest, but we're not going to go over those right now. This can be looked at later, or it can be looked up in the article that we've published on this matter. But let's focus here on what I call the main quantities of interest, that is provider and acquisition place. So what motivates information use in North Korea? A family or a friend or a family member provides it to you. Neighbors and strangers demotivate use because they're not trusted. That's the basic finding there. With regards to acquisition place, they would rather come into it in their own home. You have sort of outside park is like an unknown space. They don't know what's going on. It demotivates use. The market has a sort of positive direction, but it's not very large. However, I want to look at something which you can do here, the interaction effects, sort of conditional outcomes. And it looks a little bit something like this. So provider and place is our main quantities of interest. Let's interact them. So at the top left, you have another person's home, who provided it. So if it's at another person's home from a friend, that is perhaps the friend's home, it may motivate use and acceptance. Now, interestingly, and we focus a lot more on this in the paper, if you interact market by who provided it, you get a little bit different and a more instructive understanding of the dynamics of information use in North Korea. Markets are, of course, a place that the state regulates, but it's also sort of a semi-private space that innovative or dynamic things happen. And friend and family members providing stuff in a market is actually more likely to motivate information use than at home. If you're at your own home, that's the third at the bottom left there. Neighbor, friend, and family, potentially. Outside place, no one wants it there, basically. That is the finding. We also followed up with sort of questions to get sort of text-based responses, so qualitative responses. And what we learned is that people are interested to learn. Trust drives whether or not they use it. These are unsurprising findings about information in sort of an information cordon, or in a place where information is tightly controlled. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but they want to see and learn about the world in isolated North Korea. Of course they do. There's a tendency to watch South Korean dramas and films with friends you can trust and with family because you can go to prison if caught. Basically, the trust radius in North Korea is very tight, it's very small, and people are curious about the ways of life in capitalist or democratic countries. That's a tip to South Korea and other places. So, people prefer content from friends and family delivered at home or possibly in the market, which I think is interesting. The state looms large, co-ops information flows in social capital. Social trust in North Korea is extremely low. This is not a surprising finding, but we have found another way to prove it with regards to information flows. Despite enormous risks, which we have not really talked about here for time's sake, North Koreans desire information about and entertainment from the outside world. As I mentioned, we have an article on this. It can be looked up here, how autocracies disrupt unsanctioned information flows using North Korea as a case study. You can look that up in Problems of Post-Communism. I thank you for your time and attention. I've enjoyed presenting some of my research here, and I hope that you've learned something. Again, many thanks to the National Endowment for Democracy for funding this and our many NGO partners. Thank you.
Very informative and very stimulating research. I like that. And then our staffs are beside us, and me and they are very very intrigued into this research. And I think it's a good findings. And then there are many hypotheses we need to test, and I think you did already, and then quite interesting results. Let's start with social trust. And then what you are finding in North Korea, social trust is extremely low. But your research actually sampling, of course, this is a little bit biased because region bias, because those people the defected North Korea and then become a refugee and then settle down in probably in Canada, and then they are in the United States. I mean, and they are from Hamgyong province and then very border region. And then it's might be a little bit tough question, but do you see this social trust rebel in this border area and then Pyongyang? And we know that Pyongyang citizens also watch Korean dramas and so on, and they are extremely curious about this the foreign information. And then fortunately or unfortunately, they have diplomats and who are trade workers and then who are exposed to the outside already. And then what's your take on it?
So you are right to point out about the biased nature of the sample. There's no way to overcome that. And what we accept or claim on faith alone is that despite these being people from primarily the borderland space in North Korea, that they are still giving us answers and providing data that's broadly reflective of social dynamics in North Korea and how people would make decisions. I've been working with the North Korean defector community for about 10 years now. I've done a number of different surveys, not always on information use. So this one was kind of unique, and pretty interesting just from a researcher's point of view, interacting with the community. But qualitatively, we've talked with people from the center, right? From Pyongyang, because that's those are people with higher levels, arguably, of social capital. They're more likely to have a party background. Just qualitatively, what we find is they talk about information in the same way. I think, if anything, the dynamics which we're revealing here are underplayed in Pyongyang, as in there's both a greater interest in foreign information, but there's also greater state capacity to regulate the spread of information. So I think as a Pyongyang citizen, using foreign information is more dangerous than it is if you're, if you're in some border town in North Hamgyong province, right? So I am not. I think what we're interested here is not really the specifics of like the point estimates, but basically the dynamics that this reveals. In some ways, I think you could say our findings are extremely obvious and completely unsurprising. And I think that would, in terms of like broader academic contributions, there is something to that. But in terms of just what drives their desire for information more generally, there's some interesting findings there.
Yeah, I mean, what's in my next question? Just you answered, probably very briefly, and then the basic, bottom line, for this North Korean who are interested in the foreign information and foreign contents, they are very well aware of they are in danger, to be punished in a very severe way, but they are still taking a risk. I think this is probably obvious the answer too, but why they are doing it. I mean, just curiosity that actually overwhelm this the risk of being punished in the severe way, even death.
There is a great question. Like, why do people risk? I still think the risk of death is an edge case. The number of times that we think that people have been executed over the consumption and spread of foreign information is not zero, but it's not every day. But nevertheless, like the threat of punishment is there. I mean, it's very clear that the North Korean regime feels very threatened by this information. I use the balloons because it's the most recent example, but the law, what is it? The law on the elimination of reactionary thought and culture, in English anyway, is a clear reaction of the North Korean regimes to a demand for foreign information, which they think threatens to undermine their legitimacy. Obviously, people want the information. The best way is to sit down with someone who is from North Korea, maybe that's a little bit more recently defected, and be like, what information do you want? Most of the time it's dramas, right? They just want to be entertained. They're completely aware that people in other free places watch drama for leisure. And I don't know about you, but I watch dramas pretty regularly of the South Korean variant and of, American, Canadian, whatever. So there's I think a basic human instinct to be free in consuming the information you want for entertainment purposes, but also for curiosity with regards to the outside world, because human beings are curious by nature. We seek to know for the sake of knowing. And I think that is both a quality of human behavior and also something with, in the case of highly autocratic regimes, extreme political implications, because North Korea seeks to control that. Doesn't stop people, though.
Yeah, I think so. And then, you mentioned about those distribution media, say USB. Actually, you using USB for your front page for your presentation. How can we approach this role of USB in then distributing and then receiving this information, foreign information?
So what we learned is, unsurprisingly, people tell us through the survey, through our interviews, and if you just do a bit of background research, you can find this too, that USBs are the most preferred distribution media for people seeking outside information. It's also most likely to increase the probability that it will be used, as one could infer from their own research or survey experiment findings. They're mobile, they're easy to conceal, and they're easy to use. So all things considered, the distribution media type is USB. I will note that CDs and DVDs are also valuable. And the reason for that is a lot of the devices people use to consume the media often have a CD drive. And one thing that people complain about sometimes is USBs break. Yeah, but CDs break too. But in any case, CD, DVD, or USB is the distribution media that people prefer and they most use. And this is sort of corroborated by just talking to people about their experiences actually using the media.
Okay.
Yeah.
We are done. Thank you. Thank you so much.